I'm Robert Barnes from Spider Machines, and in this video series we're going to talk about calibrating your registration bearings. I get asked all the time, do I need a technician to calibrate my bearings? Well, I'm going to do a step-by-step presentation on how you, one, check your bearings, check the calibration of your bearings, and how you would adjust the bearings if they're out. And then we'll leave it up to you to decide whether you want a technician or you can do it yourself. Now, bearing registration is similar on most carousel machines. This is an M&R Gauntlet Series 2. Basically, the principles behind registering is that you have a rigid mass, which we call the wheel or the pallet arms, mating with another rigid mass, which is the top of the machine or the printhead section. So basically, it indexes and registers, and it meshes like a gear. There are 3 registration forks, and these 3 registration forks create a triangulation so that any variance that you have, when you mate these two together, the 3 forks will take that variance out. And typically, when you raise the machine up into the forks, you will certainly notice that 1 bearing you cannot rotate with your hand, but perhaps 2 you can, or only 1. And this shows you, as you're checking that there are slight deviations within the machine. This is the 12 color Gauntlet Series 2, and the 10 color is actually my favorite machine from M&R. The Gauntlet Series 2 10 color. 12 color's got a little bit of a shimmy to it, but so what we're going to look at is whether you're looking at a M&R Gauntlet Series 2 or an older Gauntlet, which we're going to talk about next. The basic principles are the same. So this is a 12 color 14 station Mustang. This machine is a servo lift, servo index AC head machine. So I just want to do a little bit of a plug because obviously I'm showing the machine to you. But basically the mechanism on the Mustang is a little bit more sophisticated than the old technology of the Advance. And we'll get a close-up shot of all this for you. But I like to use a dial indicator. So if you want to use a Mitutoyo dial indicator, my opinion why you should use digital is it gives you a far better accuracy. It's easy to write it down. You make less mistakes. So I strongly suggest you invest the money in getting a digital gauge, but you can do it with an analog gauge. And so up next we're going to zoom in. We're going to show exactly how you calibrate the bearings and check for clearance and tolerance. So this is your digital gauge, and if you notice as I push on this, it gives us a digital reading of where this arm is going to strike it. Now on the other end of this arm is a pin, and so we're going to pull out this Allen, and you'll see that this arm pivots and it strikes the digital indicator, but it also strikes the bearing here. So when setting this device up, you need to make sure that you have it positioned correctly in and out so it doesn't strike the casting as this pivot arm comes along, and you want to try to strike the middle of that bearing. So if that's the bearing and this is your striker, you want to make sure that you strike it in the middle, in and up and down. So you want to try to strike the middle of that bearing the best you can. Now most gauges you're going to buy are about a 1/2 inch or 12 millimeter. Some are 1 inch. The Mustang, they actually built their registration device to accommodate so you can actually adjust this if you had different travel or a different size gauge. So this is the pivot arm, and a nice little lock here and a spring, and the purpose of the spring is to keep a consistent tension as you're reading that bearing. So this is how you do it. Now the principle of this bearing in relation to that fork is we're essentially reading a difference between what that bearing is and where this bearing is suspended in air. So the bar that all this mounts to has to be extremely rigid. You want to make sure there's no play in this mechanism. You want to make sure there's no play in your pivot arm. And you want to make sure that all of this is solid and your registration fork is solid. Now if you're just checking the registration on your machine, you'll leave all 3 of your registration forks in place. And then you're going to read each bearing, position 1 through 14 in this case. You'll read bearing by bearing by bearing, and then you'll write this number down. And when you're done, you want to be within 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch total variance. So from the worst to the best, if you so will, you want to be within 1,000 or 2 of an inch. So one of the tricks that you want to make sure that you do when you're calibrating is you want to use bungee cords, and you can buy these at any store. They're just a basic bungee cord, a little bit better than the cheap flimsy ones, but a basic bungee cord. And you will take that bungee cord and you will strap it to the head in some way so that the bungee can put consistent pressure on the pallet arm that you're actually reading. So you stretch this bungee cord back to the head and you stretch it over the pallet arm so that it pulls the arm in a consistent way while you're reading the bearing. Okay, now that we have our bungee cord on, all we're basically going to do is swivel the mechanism, and we're going to get a digital reading. And then we're going to write down, in this case, a 14-station machine, so we're going to write down all of those readings. Now, if the greatest number to the least number is within 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch, then you don't have a registration problem. So in this case, when you first approach the machine, you leave all 3 forks in place and you can check your registration. Now, if you want to go an extra step, you can remove 2 of the forks and then check it just based on the 1 fork. If you find that you're out of the 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch, then you'll have to adjust each bearing based on your average number. So you'll add up all 14 numbers on your list, divide by 14, and that becomes your new number. And we'll be adjusting the bearing to achieve that number. We'll show you how to do that next. So the bearing block, you have the bearing, you have its 2 lockdowns, and then you have these set screws on both sides. So essentially what you would be doing, now I'm showing you here, but we'll be doing it under the gauge, is you're going to loosen these bolts here and here, and then you'll be using an Allen in here, and as you turn that Allen, it will move the bearing. So that process has to be done here next to the registration fork. So it's a simple matter of loosening both of the bolts, taking your set screw and backing it out, and on the other side tightening it up. So it's really just a matter of shoving with some tension on these bolts, shoving this block back and forth under the gauge. You're going to do that under the gauge to get the appropriate average reading. Okay, so in this shot you see the capture fork and the bearing engaging the capture fork. So one of the things that you want to look for on an older machine is to make sure you don't have excessive wear here where this bearing is very loose inside your fork. If that's the case, then you probably need to replace the forks, and in many cases you may even need to replace the bearings. So you want to make sure that you check that, because I call that chasing your tail. If you don't assure yourself that all of your devices are tight and all of your parts are tight, then you'll be chasing your tail trying to get your machine to register. So once again, you've got to make sure that you have good, smooth raising and lowering. Now this machine is a Mustang, it's a servo lift, so it's obviously a lot smoother than the airlift machines. But you still want to get a nice smooth lift, engaging and disengaging from the fork. You want to inspect that your fork doesn't have excessive wear and that your bearings aren't failing. So on an old M&R, you have the Z-bar. The Z-bar mounts here in the center of the machine, and this bar is basically levitated over the bearing. And then this device, the old Advanced American device, slips over that bar. And this pivoting mechanism is essentially what we saw on the Mustang. That pivoting mechanism is what gives you that readout. So even if you're using these older devices, you can still achieve accuracy. And whether you want to do it yourself or hire a technician, hopefully you've learned some things from this video and you can make that decision for yourself. I'm Robert Barnes from Spider Machines. If you need any information on registering your machine or any advice about machines, feel free to email me. It's robert@spidermachines.com. I strongly suggest you visit my blog. It's spiderpromo.com.